The Echo of 1965, Chapter 1, The Weight of an Unremembered Past. The Central Park bench had been Evelyn Marshall's constant for the past 5 years, a steadfast companion in the quiet solitude that followed her husband George's passing. At 75, Evelyn possessed an elegant composure, her silver hair neatly coiffed, her eyes, though softened by age, still holding a keen, observant spark. She found solace in the park's enduring rhythm, the laughter of children, the rustle of leaves, the distant thrum of the city, a comforting counterpoint to the profound stillness that had settled within her own life. Yet beneath this placid surface lay an unsettling void. The year 1965. It was a blank canvas in the sprawling gallery of her memories, a locked room she rarely dared to approach. It was a Tuesday, crisp with the promise of autumn, the maples just beginning to blush with reds and golds. Evelyn was watching a young woman push a stroller, a faint, wistful smile playing on her lips, when a shadow fell across her. She looked up. A man stood beside her bench, older than herself, perhaps in his late 70s, his face a roadmap of time, etched with lines of experience and a deep, ineffable sadness in his eyes. He clutched a worn, leather-bound book, his knuckles white. His gaze, however, was fixed on her intensely, as if searching for a forgotten piece of himself. "Evelyn?" he asked, his voice soft, raspy with age, yet holding an undeniable certainty. Evelyn's brow furrowed. She searched her mind, but no flicker of recognition sparked. Not even a ghost of a memory. "Yes," she replied, a touch of wary politeness in her tone. A small, melancholic smile touched his lips, a gesture of profound understanding that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You don't remember me, do you?" he said, his voice laced with a gentle sorrow. "It's been a long time, almost 60 years to be precise." He paused, his gaze deepening, studying her face as if committing it to memory. "You saved my life in 1965. The words struck Evelyn with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Saved his life? In 1965? Her mind reeled, frantically scrambling through the decades, desperate for a foothold, a single thread of recollection. But there was nothing. A vast, terrifying emptiness. No face, no event, no echo of heroism. The very year itself felt like a chasm. A cold, unsettling dread began to creep up her spine, chilling her to the bone. I'm afraid you have me mistaken, sir," Evelyn stammered, her voice suddenly thin, reedy. I don't remember you, or anything like that." The man nodded, a deep, weary sigh escaping him. "I expected as much," he said, his gaze tinged with a profound sadness that seemed to stretch across decades. It was Brighton, Massachusetts, a fire. He saw the bewilderment, the sheer blankness in her eyes, a reflection of his own long-held burden. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded, brittle, yellowed newspaper clipping. He placed it gently on the bench beside her, its edges fragile with age. The headline, in bold, dramatic type, screamed, "School engulfed in flames. Child rescued by unidentified heroine." Below it, a faded, grainy black and white photograph of a building wreathed in smoke and flames. And in the second paragraph, a single name leaped out at her, searing itself into her consciousness. Liam Mitchell. "My name is David Mitchell," the man said, his voice a quiet murmur against the city's backdrop. "Liam was my younger brother. You pulled him out of that fire. You were barely 20 yourself. A hero. But something happened that day, something that obscured it for you." He reached into his other pocket, producing a small, worn business card. "Here's my number, my address. When you remember, or if you want to know more, call me." He didn't linger, didn't press. He simply turned, his back straight despite his advanced years, and walked away, melting into the stream of passers-by, leaving Evelyn alone on the bench, the ancient newspaper clipping, a stark, chilling testament to a past she couldn't grasp. Evelyn stared at the article, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. Brighton, Massachusetts. Yes, she had lived there briefly in her early 20s, a tumultuous time before she definitively moved to New York. A school fire, a child named Liam Mitchell, and her being a hero. Why was it so utterly, terrifyingly blank? Why was 1965 a gaping hole in her life? She spent the remainder of the day in a disoriented haze, back in her apartment, a quiet space now filled with a new, unsettling resonance. She searched through old photo albums, eager for any visual cue, but pictures from 1965 were conspicuously absent. A few from 1964, a scattering from 1966. Her life already shifting, but 1965 was a stark, glaring omission. It wasn't just this man, David Mitchell, she couldn't recall. It was the entire year. A profound, deeply unsettling realization began to dawn on her. Something truly significant, something traumatic beyond her comprehension, had indeed been scrubbed from her memory. She felt compelled to call Sarah, her oldest and dearest friend, who had also lived in Brighton for a short period before they both settled in New York. Sarah, usually a fount of shared anecdotes and vibrant recollections, sounded different when Evelyn tentatively broached the subject of 1965 and the Brighton fire. "Oh, Evelyn," Sarah sighed, a heavy, uncomfortable sound that spoke volumes. Her voice, usually so cheerful, grew strained, distant. That was a terrible time. Just awful. You were so upset. It's truly better left in the past, honey. Really. Some things, it's best to just let them go." Sarah's evasiveness, her palpable discomfort, only intensified Evelyn's unease. Better not to remember? Why? What could be so profoundly unsettling that it needed to be forgotten, actively suppressed? David Mitchell's quiet words, "Something happened that day, something that erased it for you," echoed in her mind, now charged with a sinister undertone. He believed her amnesia was real, and Sarah's reluctance to discuss it only reinforced that belief, deepening the mystery. The man on the bench, a complete stranger, had in a single quiet encounter just unlocked a door to a forgotten chapter of her life, a chapter that held a profound, hidden truth. And Evelyn, for the first time in decades, felt a chilling certainty she was not merely an unwitting hero, but a victim of her own deeply buried past. The silence that had defined her recent years was nothing compared to the deafening silence of 1965. Chapter 2. The Whispers of Clues. The old newspaper clipping remained Evelyn's focal point, a fragile anchor in the churning sea of her confusion. Liam Mitchell, a child saved from a terrifying inferno by her, yet the memory itself remained tantalizingly out of reach, like a word perpetually on the tip of her tongue, dissolving into frustrating emptiness the moment she tried to grasp it. Her days became a restless cycle of rereading the article, staring at the blank space in her photo albums, and trying to summon the elusive ghost of 1965. The following morning, a pull stronger than habit drew Evelyn back to her bench in Central Park. David Mitchell wasn't there, and a surprising pang of disappointment, a strange sense of loss, tightened in her chest. She had so many questions, so much desperate confusion, and he held the key. But then her gaze caught on something small, tucked neatly beside her usual spot. It was a 45 RPM record, its vinyl scuffed, its label faded but legible. The Sound of Silence by Simon and Garfunkel, a quintessential song from 1965. A shiver of recognition, cold and sharp, ran down her spine. He was leaving her clues, subtle personal breadcrumbs, designed to stir something deep within her. The next day, another object appeared. A small wooden toy train, intricately carved and painted with faded primary colors, resting precisely where the record had been. Evelyn picked it up, her fingers tracing the smooth, worn wood. A sudden, fleeting image pierced her mind. A child's hand, small and grubby, clutching a similar toy. It was followed by a faint scent, acrid, metallic smoke that pricked at her nostrils, then vanished as quickly as it came. These weren't just random objects. They were triggers, carefully chosen, meticulously placed, designed to unlock something buried deep within her subconscious. David continued this quiet, deliberate ritual for days, sometimes appearing briefly in the distance, sometimes simply leaving his offering. A children's book, Harold and the Purple Crayon, its cover faded, its pages dog-eared. A favorite of her own childhood, a crumpled, empty candy wrapper from a brand popular in the mid-60s. Each item, innocuous on its own, carried a hidden weight, stirring the murky waters of her forgotten past. Evelyn started to experience more vivid, yet still disjointed flashes. The blare of a distant siren, a cacophony of shouts, the overwhelming, suffocating heat of a confined space, a muffled, desperate cry, the feeling of intense heart-pounding panic, and always a profound sense of disorientation, a disorienting haze that veiled the edges of the memory. The newspaper clipping, now almost a part of her, became her constant companion, her only tangible link to the past. She read it over and over, scrutinizing every word, every phrase. Brighton High School, it stated, suffered extensive damage from a blaze that started in the art classroom on the second floor. Leah Mitchell, identified as a fifth grader, was found trapped in that very classroom. The article praised the quick thinking and bravery of a young woman who, at great personal risk, entered the burning building and carried the boy to safety. But the name remained elusive. Unidentified heroine. Why? Why no mention of her? And why did the article only vaguely mention the cause of the fire, calling it undetermined, though possibly electrical? The more she read, the more she felt an insistent tug, a deep-seated intuition that something crucial was missing. Evelyn's frustration mounted, evolving into a quiet, burning determination. This wasn't just memory loss from an old injury. This felt like active suppression, as if something or someone didn't want her to remember. Sarah's evasiveness, David's careful, almost paternal hints, the very silence of the newspaper, it all pointed to a deeper, darker truth. A truth that was deliberately buried. One crisp afternoon, unable to bear the weight of her confusion any longer, Evelyn called the number David had given her. It rang twice, then a quiet, measured voice answered, David Mitchell, a sigh of profound relief evident in his tone. I'll meet you there, the old public library. It's where you always used to study, you know. I'll be there tomorrow, at 10 o'clock. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating. a plunge into the unknown that promised either devastation or profound clarity. Brighton. The very name now resonated with a haunting echo. The place of her erased past. She needed to confront it. To break through the impenetrable fog of amnesia that had held her captive for decades. She needed to know what truly happened in 1965, not just for David, not just for Liam, but for herself, for the young woman she had been, whose heroic act was eclipsed by a sinister secret, for the woman she was meant to be, unburdened by forgotten truths. The journey back was not merely physical, it was a desperate, hopeful odyssey into the very heart of her own unspoken, deeply buried history. Chapter 3. Brighton's Lingering Scars. Brighton, Massachusetts, despite the passage of 59 years, held a peculiar blend of the familiar and the foreign. Modern storefronts now lined the bustling main street, but beneath the veneer of progress, the underlying colonial architecture, the sturdy brick buildings, the narrow winding roads, the ancient elm trees, still carried the undeniable echoes of the past. Evelyn felt an unsettling mix of recognition and estrangement. Every corner, every faint scent of damp earth and old brick seemed to whisper to a forgotten part of her soul, sending shivers of recognition and dread down her spine. The old public library stood as a timeless sentinel on a quiet, tree-lined street. Its red brick facade now softened by a creeping cloak of ivy. David Mitchell was waiting for her on the stone steps, precisely as he said he would be, a solitary figure against the backdrop of changing leaves. He wore a simple tweed jacket, and his eyes, though still holding that deep sorrow, seemed to lighten, almost imperceptibly, at her approach. "Thank you for coming, Evelyn," he said, his voice gentle, a quiet ripple in the crisp autumn air. "It means more than you know. More than I can say." "I need to know, David," Evelyn replied, her voice firm, unwavering despite the tremor in her hands. "Everything. Why don't I remember? What really happened that day?" He led her inside the library, a space hushed and revered, filled with the comforting, slightly musty scent of old books and polished wood. They found a secluded table in a sunlit corner, tucked away from the hushed murmurs of patrons, a private space for a long-awaited confession. "You lived here briefly, with your Aunt Susan," David began, his voice low, measured, like someone carefully unwrapping a fragile, ancient artifact. "You were a bright, earnest young woman, full of idealism, studying to be a teacher. You volunteered after school at Brighton High. That's where Liam went, my little brother. He was 10, a timid, artistic boy, prone to getting lost in his own world. He absolutely adored you. You were his favorite volunteer. Always patient, always kind." David's words painted a vivid picture Evelyn could almost see, almost feel. Her younger self, brimming with youthful idealism, connecting with children. It felt right, an authentic echo of a core part of her being, even if the specific memories remained elusive. On that fateful day, October 17th, 1965, David continued, his voice strained with emotion, the memory clearly agonizing for him. Liam had stayed late for an art club. The fire started in his classroom. On the second floor, a quick, furious blaze, fueled by something more than just paper. The fire alarms went off, a deafening shriek. Everyone evacuated, pouring out into the schoolyard. But Liam, he froze. He was scared, terribly scared. The art teacher, a new, inexperienced woman, panicked. She locked the classroom door behind her, thinking everyone was out, and fled. Liam was trapped, alone, in a burning room. Evelyn felt a visceral jolt, a cold dread washing over her. As if she were there again, she could almost hear the frantic crackling of flames, the rising heat, the distant shouts. You were in the main office helping with some paperwork when you heard the alarms, David explained, his eyes fixed on some distant point, reliving the horror. You heard the screams, someone yelling, "Liam's still inside, he's in the art room." Without a thought, without hesitation, without a shred of fear for your own safety, you ran back into the burning building, straight into the smoke and the intensifying flames. You found him in that classroom, huddled, terrified, under a desk. You pulled him out, Evelyn. You carried him, a 10-year-old boy, through those smoke-filled, collapsing corridors. Evelyn closed her eyes, and suddenly, a fragmented, visceral image flashed in her mind, stronger than anything she'd experienced before. The blinding orange glow of the fire, the acrid, metallic taste of smoke in her mouth, the stifling heat, the surprisingly heavy weight of a small child in her arms, his small face pressed tightly against her shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably. A profound, overwhelming sense of relief that she had found him, followed by a searing, explosive pain in her head. "You got him out," David said, his voice thick with emotion, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. "You carried him to safety. But as you exited the main doors, just steps from freedom, a large wooden beam, weakened by the relentless fire, collapsed. It struck you directly, on the head." He pointed to his own temple, indicating the precise spot. "You were rushed to the hospital, unconscious. You had a severe concussion. You were in and out of consciousness for days. When you finally woke up, you couldn't remember the fire. Not really. Just disjointed fragments. And most importantly, you definitely didn't remember how it started, or who started it." Evelyn's gaze hardened, a new, chilling understanding dawning in her eyes. "How did it start, David? The newspaper, the police, they all said undetermined. But you said something happened, something that erased it for me." Her voice was quiet, but laced with a controlled fury. David's eyes darkened, filled with a familiar, deep-seated pain that seemed to radiate from his very core. He took a long, shaky breath, as if bracing himself for an even heavier confession. "The fire, it wasn't an accident, Evelyn. Not in the slightest. It was arson. And my father, he started it." The words hung in the quiet library, heavy and suffocating. Each syllable a hammer blow to Evelyn's carefully constructed reality. She stared at him, stunned, her mind struggling to process this monstrous revelation. Liam's father, an arsonist, the man she had saved, his life jeopardized by the very hands that should have protected him. The layers of deception, fear, and human frailty began to peel back, revealing a terrifying truth beneath. "He was deep in debt, Evelyn," David confessed, his voice barely a whisper, filled with a profound, decades-old shame. A devastating gambling addiction, an alcoholic. He had lost everything, the house, his business, his dignity. He thought the insurance money from the school was his only way out. He had planned it meticulously, ruthlessly. He started the fire late, when he believed the school was completely empty. But Liam had snuck back in to retrieve a book he'd forgotten. And you, Evelyn, you unwittingly ruined his monstrous plan by saving Liam. Because you were a witness, You saw him. He knew you saw him. A chilling memory, sharp and vivid, pierced through the last lingering tendrils of her amnesia, crystallizing with terrifying clarity. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, stifling a cry. She remembered it now, a figure silhouetted against the blinding orange glow of the nascent inferno, holding a can, a face contorted in fear and desperate rage, turning to look at her as she rushed past. Driven by a primal need to save the child's cries, it was Liam's father. His eyes, wild and desperate, had locked with hers for a fleeting, terrifying second. "He came to the hospital, didn't he?" Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling, laced with dawning horror. "He came to my room. He gave me something." A faint, sickeningly sweet taste filled her mouth, followed by a memory of overwhelming grogginess, a disorientation deeper than the concussion. He made sure I wouldn't remember, didn't he? He stole that memory from me. David nodded, tears finally overflowing, streaming down his weathered face. "He did. He confessed it to my mother years later, before he disappeared completely. He had put something in your water in the hospital, something to deepen the amnesia, to blur the edges of that specific memory, to ensure you couldn't identify him. He was utterly terrified, Evelyn. You were the only witness who could definitively connect him to the arson. And he knew you were a good person. He knew you would speak the truth." Evelyn felt a wave of profound, aching sorrow. Not just for Liam, not just for David, but for her own lost innocence, her own stolen memory. She hadn't just suffered an injury. She had been actively, maliciously silenced. A witness tampered with. Her truth buried to protect a criminal. And a family torn apart by a monster. The forgotten past, now remembered, was far more complex, more heartbreaking, and more sinister than she could have ever imagined. The echo of 1965 resonated not just with the wail of sirens and the roar of flames, but with the chilling whisper of a buried crime and the silent, enduring suffering of a family shattered by deception. And Evelyn, a victim of that day, finally understood the true depth of her own sacrifice. Chapter 4. The Mother's Final Confession. The weight of the full truth, once a crushing, unattainable burden, began to transform into a strange, liberating force for Evelyn. Her amnesia, once a terrifying blankness, was now understood not as a flaw in her own mind, but as a deliberate act, a testament to her courage and the tragic consequence of a criminal's desperation. The fragmented memories, those frustrating, elusive glimpses, coalesced now, forming a complete, harrowing narrative of that pivotal day in 1965. She had not only run into a burning building, rescued a child, and sustained a severe injury, she had also witnessed a heinous crime, and then had her memory actively stolen to protect a family's dark secret. All these years, Evelyn whispered, her gaze distant, fixed on a forgotten corner of the library, as if seeing the ghosts of the past playing out before her. I thought I was just forgetting, getting old, attributing it to the concussion, but it was a deliberate act. He stole a part of me. He stole my truth. A flicker of anger, cold and sharp, ignited within her, a righteous indignation for the injustice, but it quickly faded, replaced by a profound, aching sense of understanding for David and for his mother, Marilyn. They too had been victims, living for decades under the chilling shadow of a monstrous secret. My mother always believed that truth, no matter how painful, eventually sets you free, David said, his voice raw, thick with emotion, as if the words themselves were shedding a layer of his own long-held pain. She passed that belief on to me. It's why I finally came for you. You deserve to know. We both deserve to be free of it. He reached into his worn leather book once more, pulling out a delicate folded letter, its paper thin and brittle with age. My mother's last letter. She wrote it to me just before she passed away 10 years ago. She wanted me to know the full truth, everything she had kept hidden, everything she had suffered. Evelyn took the letter, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. The handwriting was elegant, yet the strokes were at times shaky, betraying the turmoil of the woman who penned it. My dearest David, if you are reading this, I am gone, and with my passing, I can no longer carry the crushing weight of this silence. There are things you must know, things I protected you from, and things I regret with every fiber of my being, keeping from Evelyn for so long. Your father, his sickness, his gambling, his alcoholism, they consumed him. The fire at the school was his desperate, terrible act. You saw him, didn't you, my son? I know you did. You were just a boy, too afraid to speak, too afraid to lose the only parent you thought you had left. I understood. I protected you, my son, with every ounce of my strength. But then there was Evelyn, the brave, wonderful girl who, against all odds, saved your brother. She saw him. I know she did. Your father came to me after he saw her in the hospital, terrified, unhinged. He told me he went to her room, that he gave her something, mixed into her water, to ensure she wouldn't remember his face, wouldn't connect him to the fire. He was convinced she was the key witness, the one who could expose him. He threatened to harm her, to harm us, to take Liam and disappear if I ever spoke a single word. I was weak, David. I was scared beyond reason. I let him do it. I should have told her. I should have protected her. She deserved the truth. Her amnesia was not just an accident, David. It was an act of silencing. Forgive me, my son. Forgive me for my cowardice, for the choices I made out of fear. And please, promise me you will find Evelyn. Tell her everything. She deserves peace. She deserves to know the terrible truth of what she truly sacrificed for us, for our family's twisted survival. Your loving mother, Marilyn Mitchell. Evelyn's hands trembled violently as she finished reading, her eyes blurring with tears. Marilyn Mitchell, David's mother. The weight of her sacrifice, her quiet complicity, her desperate plea for forgiveness pressed down on Evelyn, a testament to a different kind of heroism, born of fear and flawed love. She hadn't just been a victim of circumstance. She had been a casualty of fear, manipulated and silenced to protect a family torn apart by a monster. The secret was not just Daniel's guilt, but the active, malevolent suppression of her own memory, a deeper betrayal than she could have imagined. My mother was haunted by it, Evelyn, David said, his voice raw, thick with a lifetime of pain. She lived with that guilt every single day. She knew what she had done, what she had allowed. She wanted me to find you, to tell you, to give you back what he took. But I was scared too, scared of what you would remember, scared of the truth, scared of bringing it all back up for both of us. But when I saw you in the park, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. She deserved her peace, and you, Evelyn, you deserved yours. Evelyn looked at David, truly seeing him for the first time, not as the stranger on the bench, but as a man who had carried his own silent burden for nearly 6 decades. The profound shame of his father's monstrous crime, the agonizing weight of his mother's secret, the crushing responsibility of protecting Liam. and the agonizing guilt of knowing her memory, her very truth, had been stolen to facilitate their survival. His sorrowful eyes, his quiet, almost withdrawn demeanor, they were all products of a lifetime spent guarding a devastating, unspeakable truth. "Liam, does he know?" Evelyn asked, her voice soft, tentative. David shook his head, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "He only knows you saved him. He knows there was a fire and that our father left abruptly. He has vague, almost dreamlike memories of a beautiful young woman carrying him out, a bright light, then darkness. He built a good life, Evelyn, a wonderfully good life. He's a successful artist, just like he always wanted to be. He has a family. I never wanted to burden him with the full ugliness of it, not until now." Evelyn felt a deep, aching surge of compassion for David. He had sacrificed his own peace, his own emotional freedom, for the sake of his family, for the brother she had saved. And in doing so, he had, in his own way, become another silent victim of that terrifying day. The quiet breadcrumbs in the park, the cryptic clues, his hesitant, almost fearful approach, they were all part of his desperate, courageous attempt to finally unburden himself, to honor his mother's dying wish, and to finally give Evelyn the truth she deserved. The echo of 1965 resonated not just with fire and sirens, but with the profound, tangled web of human fear, sacrifice, and the enduring, unbreakable power of hidden truths. Evelyn realized that her unexpected encounter with David was not just about recalling a forgotten act of heroism, but about healing a deep, shared wound that had silently defined both their lives for nearly 6 decades. Chapter 5, Unburdening and Beyond. The weight of the full truth, once a crushing, unattainable burden, began to transform into a strange, profound, liberating force for Evelyn. Her amnesia, once a terrifying blankness, a source of quiet anxiety, was now understood not as a flaw in her own mind, but as a testament to her courage and the tragic consequence of a criminal's desperate act. The fragmented memories, those frustrating, elusive glimpses that had plagued her for decades, now coalesced, forming a complete, harrowing narrative of that pivotal day in 1965. She had not only run into a burning building, rescued a child, and sustained a severe injury, she had also witnessed a heinous crime, and then had her memory actively, maliciously stolen to protect a family's dark secret. All these years, Evelyn whispered, her gaze distant, fixed on a forgotten corner of the library, as if seeing the ghosts of the past playing out before her. I thought I was just forgetting, attributing it to old age, to the concussion, but it was a deliberate act. He stole a part of me. He stole my truth. A flicker of anger, cold and sharp, ignited within her, a righteous indignation for the injustice, for the violation. But it quickly faded, replaced by a profound, aching sense of understanding for David and for his mother, Marilyn. They too had been victims, living for decades under the chilling shadow of a monstrous secret, bound by fear and complicity. My mother always believed that truth, no matter how painful, eventually sets you free, David said, his voice raw, thick with emotion, as if the words themselves were shedding a layer of his own long-held pain. She passed that belief on to me. It's why I finally came for you. You deserve to know. We both deserve to be free of it, to finally breathe. Evelyn looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time, not as the stranger on the bench, but as a man who had carried his own silent burden for nearly 6 decades. The profound shame of his father's monstrous crime, the agonizing weight of his mother's complicity, the crushing responsibility of protecting Liam, and the agonizing guilt of knowing her memory, her very truth, had been stolen to facilitate their survival. His sorrowful eyes, his quiet, almost withdrawn demeanor, they were all products of a lifetime spent guarding a devastating, unspeakable truth. "And now?" she asked softly, her voice filled with a tentative hope. David met her gaze, a faint, hopeful smile finally playing on his lips, a genuine lightness in his sorrow-filled eyes. "Now, Evelyn, we can finally tell the story. Not just the heroics, but the truth, all of it, the whole, messy, complicated truth." Over the next few weeks, Evelyn and David met regularly, their conversations spanning hours, delving into the deepest corners of their pasts. In David's quiet apartment, amidst stacks of old books and family photographs, they painstakingly pieced together the full narrative. Evelyn recounted her fragmented memories, now vivid and complete, each detail clicking into place with a chilling precision. David filled in the agonizing gaps with his own painful recollections, his mother's letter, and the grim details of his father's dark life and eventual disappearance. They even revisited Brighton, not just the library, but the old school grounds, now transformed into a vibrant community center, the local fire station, the quiet, tree-lined streets that held so many secrets. They managed to find an elderly former firefighter, now long retired, who vaguely remembered the peculiar circumstances of the Brighton High fire, how unusually quickly the investigation had been closed, almost as if someone, somewhere, wanted it suppressed. His recollections, though hazy, confirmed enough details to strengthen their narrative. The process was deeply cathartic, a profound healing that reached into wounds neither of them fully realized they still carried. David found immense release in finally sharing the crushing burden of his father's crime, in knowing Evelyn understood his mother's impossible choices. Evelyn, in turn, found validation in the horrifying truth of her amnesia and a profound sense of closure for the missing, violated piece of her past. She wasn't just a hero who had forgotten an act of bravery. She was a survivor of a much larger, darker ordeal, an unwilling casualty in a desperate criminal act. They decided to write a book together, not a sensationalized true crime exposé, but a deeply personal account of memory, trauma, and the enduring power of truth. Evelyn, with her clear, precise memory of the event and her eloquent, evocative narrative style, would write from her perspective, focusing on the sensory details and emotional impact. David, with his detailed knowledge of the family history, the secret machinations, and the long-held burdens, would provide the deeper context, the chilling background. They called it simply The Echo of 1965. The book became their shared project, their unexpected purpose, a new chapter forged from the ashes of the old. It was a painstaking, yet profoundly rewarding endeavor. They spent countless hours talking, not just about the fire, but about their lives, their individual losses, their quiet joys, and the strange, unexpected turns their paths had taken. They discovered a deep, resonant connection, a unique bond forged in the crucible of a shared, traumatic past. Their friendship blossomed, unexpected and comforting, a testament to the fact that even in the twilight of life, when one might assume all major connections have been made, new and profoundly meaningful relationships can be found. When the book was finally published, it was a quiet success. It resonated deeply with readers who carried their own forgotten memories, their own lingering questions, their own unspoken burdens of the past. It wasn't about sensationalism, it was about human resilience, the courage to confront painful truths, and the quiet dignity of forgiveness. It sparked conversations, ignited forgotten memories in others, and became a beacon for those seeking their own closure. Liam, now a successful artist living across the country, a man whose life she had literally saved, learned the full, devastating truth of his father's actions and Evelyn's profound sacrifice for the first time when he read the book. He called Evelyn, his voice thick with overwhelming emotion, expressing his immense gratitude and a raw, aching sorrow for the pain she had endured. He finally understood his own fragmented childhood memories, the impenetrable family silence, and the complex, crushing burden his older brother, David, had carried alone for so long. The book brought a strange, bittersweet closure to his own story. Evelyn, sitting once again on her favorite bench in Central Park, no longer felt the void. The park, once a gentle refuge from her past, now felt like a place of vibrant fullness, of interconnected life. David often joined her, and they would talk for hours, not just about the book, but about everything and nothing. The silence between them now was comfortable, filled with understanding, with shared history, not with buried secrets. She looked at David, her friend, her unexpected confidant, the man whose life she had saved, and who, in turn, had given her back her own. The past, once a locked, terrifying room, was now open, airing out decades of dust and shadows. It was painful, yes, at times overwhelmingly so, but it was real. And in that raw, remembered reality, Evelyn found not just peace, but a renewed sense of purpose, a profound connection, and the quiet, enduring joy of a life finally fully remembered, finally truly lived. The echo of 1965 had come not to haunt her, but to heal, to connect, and to remind her that even the longest buried truths can ultimately lead to liberation.